Welcome to Leadership Where It Matters Most. The family is the most important institution in the world. The future of the church passes through the family. The church has the greatest mission of any organization ever. Go and make disciples of all nations. The family and the church. This is where leadership matters most. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to Leadership Where It Matters Most. Today's guest is Noelle Mering. Noelle is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and is the co-author of the Theology of Home 1 and 2. Theologyofhome.com is a wonderful resource, primarily for moms, for women, but men can benefit as well. Noelle is a frequent contributor to the National Catholic Register, the American Mind, the Federalist, and the Catholic World Report. As I said, she's editor of that theologyofhome.com and lives with her husband and her 6 children in Southern California. I believe maybe 3 of her kids are off to college. In 2020, she began writing this book, which was published in 2021, called Awake, Not Woke. We're going to have reference to that in the show notes. It is an incredible work. It is historical, it's theological, it's philosophical, it's explanatory for sure, and very accessible. It's not too thick in the academic tone, but very, very practical for all people to read and benefit from. I consider this an incredible resource for Catholic leaders, for leaders in the home, for parents, to equip you in navigating kind of post-modernity with your children. Today's conversation was a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate Noelle, her insights. We certainly go through a lot of the themes and her perspective from Awake, Not Woke. We also talk a little bit about this article that she recently published in Theology of Home, the blog, called 7 Ways to Keep Wokeness Out of Your Home and Away from Your Kids. We kind of walk through the 7 points with her. She shares some testimonial things. She shares quite vulnerably of some of the difficulty and suffering season that she went through with her husband and family. And it was a real blessing, I'm sure, to many who will be able to listen to that. So Noelle Mering is a guest today. It's a great conversation. I trust that you're going to be blessed by it. Enjoy the episode. Noelle Mering, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
I really do appreciate it. And I want to say thank you for 2 reasons. One, as the podcast host, just thanks for coming and making time. But secondly, as a husband, as a father, and now as a grandfather, when we were young, it used to say that you need a village to raise a child. But given the craziness of the world, I think we need more than that even. So just real thought leaders that are allies, and the deposit of your work, the wisdom you've given us through not just the book Awake, Not Woke, but just your entire presence through Theology of Home and online and everywhere. So as a husband and father, just thank you for being such a strong voice of truth.
Oh, praise God. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you wrote Awake, Not Woke. That'll be kind of the first half of our conversation. You wrote it in 2021. I'm just curious, what compelled you to write such a thing?
I actually wrote in 2020 and it came out in 21, but the timing was pretty fascinating. So I had the idea for a while. I'd been writing articles about the woke movement starting in around 2018. It just was an endlessly fascinating subject for me. And so after a series of articles, I was kicking around the idea of the book, and then the title, Awake, Not Woke, occurred to me in one evening. And so I emailed my editor at TAN, who was a wonderful person, Brian Kennelly, and told him about the idea. And the next day he said, let's do it. And then I had a contract. So I sat down to write it, or begin researching it, actually, coinciding with the research I'd already been doing. And 2 weeks later, the quarantine shutdown began. My kids came home from college and from school, and I was sharing one computer with 5 kids.
Oh boy, I remember those days.
I had 6 kids, but one of them had her own computer in college. And so it actually was hysterical. I mean, just trying to balance it all. I moved a little outdoor table into a corner in my bedroom so I could have carve out a quiet nook, and had one of my sons try to homeschool the younger kids. And anyway, so it got going, and then a couple months later, the riots began, and so it lent a certain urgency, I think, to the project. Just felt like I'm seeing this, everything I'm researching and reading about and writing about, really spill out over into the streets in a clear way and kind of alarming way. And so I was glad that I picked a short track for writing the book. They offered me either 6 months or 12 months to do the project, and first I thought 12 months, but then my husband and my co-author for Theology of Home, Carrie Gress, actually both encouraged me to take the shorter route. And I'm so glad I did, because all of a sudden it felt so timely that I was glad to get it out there.
Yeah, 2020 allowed you to really focus on it, I guess, right?
That's right. Yeah.
I'm curious when you're writing, especially with everything blowing up as it did with the timing of writing the book. Like, was there ever a time where you were thinking, oh my gosh, do I really want to write this and put my name out here with this? Because, like, it's not well received, obviously, in many circles. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think I was sort of protected from fear of that. And I've always been sort of the type of person who's erred on the side of saying too much than saying too little. And I like people who are like that. I like having open, freewheeling conversations. And, it can get me into trouble because there's prudence that has to come into play that I've had to learn. I wasn't that afraid of sort of any sort of vitriol or blowback about writing the book. I think I had a struggle with being so open about the depth of what I believe with people who know me well, who are progressive. And so we'd always been careful with our relationships to make sure that we kept it about the relationship and not about our disagreements. And so coming out so publicly with what I believe, I think that was the one concern I had was how is this going to affect those relationships? And is it going to strain or even fracture them? But I wasn't that afraid of strangers or that type of blowback.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad. I'm glad that wasn't a struggle because it's been a great gift. So, in the introduction of the book, you focus a lot on language, the importance of language. I'm going to just quote a sentence from the book here just to introduce this. You said, once we cease to see words as having the power to reveal reality, they're reduced to reflections not of reality, but of ourselves. So, why is language such an important kind of introduction to the book on the woke movement?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one of the things, way as I frame it, I think in that same section of the book is that this is a war of words against the word. And I really think
Mm,
that is ultimately what's happening. I mean, you can look at it in a few different ways. For one, you can think of on a natural level, words either kind of reflect reality, reveal reality, or they are used to manipulate or master reality. And I think in any sort of coercive ideology, it's fraught with lies at the core of it.
mm,
And so lies cannot be open to the scrutiny of sort of those types of freewheeling conversations and a real pursuit of truth. I think what happens is that language becomes sort of terminal to thought. There's a phrase that I did not invent called thought terminating cliches, sort of,
mm,
sloganeering or kind of propaganda type of buzzwords. Love is love, these types of things. They arrest your thinking. You don't penetrate further into the idea because the slogan already has done the work for you. And so
mm,
we can just stop there. But not only do they arrest deeper thought, they also corrupt our thought. And so, you can think of the Orwellian idea of doublespeak, that oftentimes words mean the exact opposite of what they
mm,
actually mean in sort of these types of coercive ideologies. So, and the harm there, there's multiple harms. One is that, we are always we flourish when we are in tune with reality.
yeah.
And it's really detrimental to divorce ourselves from reality. But also, we ruin our ability to have community through ruining our ability to communicate. I have an
Mm,
inner life and I want to dialogue, which means dueling logos, with someone
mm,
else for the sake of sharpening each other, coming closer to arriving at the truth, making sure that we're thinking with what is real. And I think once you make words not that sort have the goal of arriving at truth, but rather to sort of change and control what is, you eradicate real ability to talk to each other. And so that's why you see so many people in kind of these sorts of coercive regimes self censoring, even trying to censor their own thoughts. That the idea of thought crimes, that the point is not just to change our language, but to change how we think about the world,
mm.
so
Yeah.
that we can be more compliant to the lies of the ideology.
Yeah. I wasn't thinking about this before when I first reached out, but I just want to share a story for you and get your perspective on this. It's a story from my own life because I really was confronted with some of this woke mindset and the power of language and all the rest of it through an experience I had. I was giving a mission to a parish. And in this mission, I really wanted people to understand the difference sort of between giving intellectual assent to the things of faith and having a real personal encounter with Jesus Christ, right? And so this idea that, there's a big difference between really knowing something and just kind of deeply experiencing something. In it, I use kind of as a metaphor, a backdrop, just the difference between knowing that there's starving children in developing countries and going to Africa for the first time and experiencing the starvation. And I happened to show a picture of this girl. Her name was Gigi, and she was sitting on my lap and she was eating on my lap or something like this. And that's it. Like, it was just an innocent showing a picture to show that, kind of quote unquote, I was there. And one of the people that were part of this mission got very upset with this and got in touch with the pastor. The pastor put her in touch with me. I ended up having a 2-hour long conversation. And it was there that I was confronted with the term whiteness for the first time, that I was blind to how I was continuing to perpetuate racial injustice by taking advantage of this child. Did the parent even know that you took the picture and all this? And I'm like, her name is Gigi. I was babysitting for half the day. Her mom took the photo. And that's when she said, your whiteness is blinding you from the injustice. And I just thought to myself, what world am I living in? What is this conversation? And it was shortly after that I stumbled upon Robin DiAngelo's work and all that. And it's like, I see what's going on here. But anyways, it was forcing this victimhood that just did not exist. And so much of what we see in wokeism is a forcing of victimhood, right? This polarization, there's oppressed and oppressors and all that. So if the woke movement was only about removing injustice, like Rosa Parks sitting on the bus saying, I'm not moving to the back or something like that, it'd be tough to argue the utility of it. But there is so much more that is going on here under the banner of justice and all these other terms. So I want to just give you permission, take as much time as you need to really help people understand kind of the foundation of what the woke movement's all about, the influence of Marxism, Frankfurt School, some of the key players and their teachings. Like, educate us on what is at the basis of this, because it's not clean, it's not tidy, it's not neat, it's not about justice. Can you give us some history?
Yeah, no, that's a really fascinating story. And I would just add that, that is so quintessentially how the movement operates, that it's really manipulative to someone who is of goodwill. So somebody in your position, and this is what I hear this time and again, that people of goodwill get manipulated by it. I don't think you did, obviously, but oftentimes people do, because they're thinking it's confusing. In the back of their minds, they keep thinking there's something not right about this, but I don't want to be harmful. I don't want to be hurting people. And I am white. And so, if that is somehow create a dominance in my mind and a bias that I'm not even aware of, it's implicit. So it's not something I'm conscious of. Most normal people are prone to self-examination and willing to correct themselves. And so it's playing on all of those, which are really very deeply Catholic instincts, to self-examine, to repent, to assume good motives in your interlocutor, even if they're deeply manipulating you. What was happening to you in that moment is so deeply manipulative, and sadly how the movement operates. So, but to your question about the history, I actually start in my book with that. It started with the snake in the garden. I do think that the movement is so, as many ideologies that are coercive so operates so much on fundamental human lies about the nature of the human person, that they're always in some ways going to be originated back to the fall of man. But I also think that, you can't understand the movement without understanding Karl Marx, who was a Hegelian and an atheist. And I think one mistake that people often make in their framing of Marx is to think that he was primarily about economic theory. And I think that was certainly secondary to his deeper beliefs, which were radical, adamant atheism, materialism, and conflict theory. And also his Hegelianism, that that we are moving towards development through history, and that the end of history will be sort of an all-seeing eye that can judge us now retrospectively. But that the way we hasten that end of history is through drawing out the conflicts in society and having those erupt against one another, and then reaching a new status quo, drawing out the contradictions and conflicts there. It's interesting too. I've been thinking recently about the idea. A priest friend of mine, and I don't think this thought was original to him necessarily, but was talking about how most heresies come from two things that should be in harmony, and breaking them apart and elevating one to the negation of the other. And that's really what conflict theory is, and what the dialectic does is that it takes two things and then puts them into conflict so that there can be no harmony between them. So really, in some ways, an inversion and a celebration of that heretical instinct. Anyway, but so Marx was very motivated by atheism, materialism, conflict in order to hasten the end of history. He also had, this idea that is a superstructure and a substructure, that the superstructure is all things in culture besides, the material elements. So it's in law, it's in the military, it's in government, it's in the cultural instincts, the cultural ethos, the family, religion, that all of these things exist to protect sort of the material interests of the powerful. And he identified three main obstacles to progress of revolution, one being private property, the second being the family, and the third being the faith. And I really focus mostly on the family and the faith, why they are targeted such obstacles to revolution. And I think, there's a few obvious ways. I mean, the faith allows us to suffer well our circumstances. And no revolution comes about through people suffering well their circumstances. They have to suffer poorly and suffer loudly. The famous Saul Alinsky quote of rub raw the sores of discontent. So you don't want people who know how to carry their cross and who are able to live in harmony with one another. You want people who have a awakened conscience to the oppression and misery that is at the core of their life and existence, so that they will be willing to revolt against it. And the family, similarly, I think, for one thing, gives us an identity that is far deeper than the sort of, identity is such a buzzword now for good reason, I think, because people have lost their identity. Mary Eberstadt writes about that beautifully in her book, Primal Screams. And I think she's spot on that, the family gives you an identity where you are named and known, and you are, in a well-ordered family, aided to see yourself with honesty. You see your faults reflected in your children and maybe through the eyes of your spouse. And so then that helps you to pivot and course correct. But you also know that you're deeply loved. And both of those things are real and important. We have to know that we are irreplaceable and have great dignity and are beloved. But we also need to try to think with reality. And so the context of the family is really the first introduction into that sort of true human anthropology that we're called to have, not just as humans, but as Christians and as sons and daughters of a good and loving God. It also is the great place for the transmission of the faith, is through the family, through the teaching and through the passing along of traditions. And, passing along of traditions is another thing that is very hostile to revolution, or the revolutions always try to break down the things that came before it. This is why we hear, sort of Marxist buzzwords, even now, today in our political climate, we'll hear, forget all that's come before us, and we're only focused on tomorrow. And tradition and history sort of binds us to some sort of reality and authority that is transcendent and is not reliant on the here and now. So, I think the faith and the family have been great targets of the ideology as far as Marx was concerned, and certainly as far as the people who came after him. So after his passing, there were a group of sort of neo-Marxists who were also very devoted to the thought of Freud. They're Freudians, who formed an institute of social research and in Frankfurt, Germany. And their goal was to analyze why the revolution had not happened. That despite, sort of efforts here and there, Marx believed it was really inevitable and that there would become this worldwide Marxist revolt. And so they formed this group to try to analyze why it hadn't happened and how can we hasten the revolution. They matriculated adjacent to Columbia University at the invitation of John Dewey in 1935. And they became known as the Frankfurt School. They were also influenced by Antonio Gramsci, Marxist. And they really played, I think, alongside Gramsci with the idea that Marx had about the superstructure, that we cannot just induce class warfare. We also have to attack all of the elements of the superstructure. So we have to attack our art. We have to attack media. We have to attack popular culture, the education system, and certainly the family. And they, did that in multiple ways. Adorno and Horkheimer went to Hollywood and really tried to understand how art can be pivoted in this country in particular and in the West to become all about political oppression. And they encouraged, that the stories of oppression, narratives of oppression should be repeated over and again and exaggerated. And that exaggeration is part of the power, that your goal is not to reflect reality, your goal is to change it. And so if you see real oppression in this world, well, blow it up, make it seem even bigger and more harmful than it is, because we want people to start only seeing their lives through this lens of oppression. And that only furthers kind of that collectivist mindset that will hasten hatred and resentment. Another thing that they were very effective at was taking over the education system. I think we see that the fruits of that pretty clearly. Many of the 60s radicals wound up pivoting to have cushy chairs at like teachers' colleges, understanding that if they could influence the people who form the various districts and the teachers in their districts, then they can disseminate the ideology very rapidly. And then thirdly, we have an important figure, Herbert Marcuse, who was sort of like a celebrity intellectual in the 60s that I'm sure you're familiar with. And he was excellent at, or successful at, understanding that you had to activate sort of bohemian culture as well as racial oppression and racial resentment. He was a mentor for Angela Davis, for example, and helped her in her radical kind of violent movement. And then feminism too. He really understood that, as all of the revolutionaries did, that you have to depose of the father and crown the mother. And that seeding resentment between that very fundamental relationship would cause a whole host of chaos. And I think, we see the rotting fruits of that certainly all around us today.
Absolutely. You mentioned the feminist side. I'm actually going to have Dr. Carrie Gress on, and we're going to talk about that at length. Really good. I mean, Awake Not Woke, just thank you so much for that and for taking the time to share some of those things. I mean, this book, for listeners that are not familiar with it, I mean, it's a history, it's theology, it's philosophy, it's explanatory. And one of the things I appreciate, Noelle, how you write is that you're pretty direct in terms of the real battle, that this is really against Jesus Christ, the ultimate victim, if you will. You don't shy away from bringing the faith right front and center. Sometimes when we're in the cultural space, we want to, it's almost like a bait and switch. Our arguments are what we're saying and bringing into those conversations, trying to soften it. But it's like, no, Christianity is useful because it's true. The center of the universe is Jesus Christ. We are loved by a Father who loves us. Our story is not about one of victimhood and oppression. It's about the love of God. So, and I mean, when you look at the cover of the book, you've got the face of Christ. So maybe you can just speak to a little bit about, Jesus as a central figure, the real victim, its onslaught against that. Maybe see a few more words about that.
Sure. Yeah, I structure the book so that I define, the core dogmas, of the movement as being, as we were talking about, those things that should be in harmony becoming in conflict. And the first is group over person, so the collectivizing of the person, absorbing him into sort of a mob. Secondly, will over reason, the elevation of our will over our reason by divorcing ourselves from any teleology, natural law, saying that, the belief, the shift that we, traditional virtue is understood to be conforming our will to what our reason perceives to be good. Then we sort of habituate ourselves to that, our will to that, and then we grow to love what is good and, be repulsed by what is evil. And this really is the opposite. It's that, what I desire crowns it as my good, not my reason, just by the mere fact of my desiring it. And so you end up with a celebration of transgressive behavior, which I talk about in the book as well. The idea that, the moral law becomes an oppressor, the idea that there is a moral law. And so every act of transgression is a way to triumph over it, to defy it. And so that's why I think you see this sort of continual pushing of the boundaries without limit, because what is transgressive today is normal tomorrow. So we have to keep moving the revolution forward. But the elevation of the will over the reason, and finally, the power over authority. There is no true authority that is good and has our good at heart. There's only oppression. And so if there's only power, divorced from reason, divorced from goodness. And then if you see what is dismissed or what is rejected in those three, you're rejecting the person, reason, and authority, which I think is, coincides pretty closely with what the word is, which is why I started out with the war of words against the word, that the logos is person of Jesus Christ, the mind of God, the author and authority of all. So I think it's an attack on him in that way, but I also think that, and write about, I think in chapter 7, the idea that, Christ is the perfectly innocent victim. And I think one of the inversions of the woke movement is that they try to claim his innocence and his victimhood. So I think the victimhood piece is obvious, that in claiming victimhood as, it sort of it sacralizes you in a way. It makes you unassailable. if you can claim a victim identity. You're excused from behavior that the people who are not in a victim identity would not be excused from. There's a hierarchy that it becomes there ostensibly to invert a hierarchy that's already in existence.
Mm-hmm.
But in claiming that sort of victimhood, I think it's also to not only to make you unassailable, but to, in a way, make you infallible. And then what happens is you claim the victimhood of, it's a claiming of the victimhood of Christ when he is the one true victim, but it's also an eagerness or an attempt to grasp at his innocence. But the movement cannot truly grasp at real innocence because it celebrates transgression.
Mm-hmm.
But the way it tries to grasp at it is by becoming the accuser. So if I can say that, well, okay, I did something wrong. Well, I'm going to deflect and point at the terrible things that people are doing around me. I can sort of gain some sort of analogical or relative innocence by shifting the contempt and the blame onto people outside of myself and never self-examining. But the other way that I think the movement targets innocence that I think is so important, I almost always bring this up, is that innocence is an obstacle to revolution. And so I think there's a real reason why we're seeing children as so targeted. That children are either sacrificed through abortion or mutilated in the transgender movement. It's always, or not always, but it primarily targets the children. And somebody else has said this before. It's not original to me, but there's a reason why there's not drag queen story hours at an old folks home.
Mm.
Why is it always that for children? Why is it always a story hour? Because children, one, you can capture the next generation. Two, you can divide the family deeply because once you get children adopted into a transgressive victim mindset, then they're going to become very hostile to their parents who are trying to pass something else down to them, something connected to their real identity and their real flourishing. But thirdly, you erase the great signpost of innocence, which is a great signpost toward pointing us towards Christ in this world, which is the child. Innocence has the ability to chasten us. Because if we're living poorly or wrongly or out of step with what we know to be right, and we encounter someone who's really virtuous, really holy, it can force us to look interiorly and say, gosh, there's a real measure, there's a metric, there's something higher. There's real goodness in this world, and I'm not living it. And so it's a deeply powerful icon of Christ. And so insofar as they can corrupt it, and I don't think every person in the movement is articulating it explicitly in their own mind, but I think the movement is animated by a spiritual, principality beyond, not of this world, that is directly trying to triumph over God. And so whether or not the individuals might be duped by it and think that they're doing something good, the movement itself, I believe deeply, is animated by this sort of really diabolical kind of attack on Christ.
Yeah. One of the things you talk about with the innocence and it being sort of maybe in that category of metaphysical beauty, like it just compels us. I remember listening on a podcast, you were telling a story of a friend of yours who went to, maybe it was like a pro-abortion rally, and there was a man there by himself wearing a sign that said, abortion on demand, always, no apologies, or something to that effect. And your friend had just simply taken his small children to this rally, and they just had this wordless encounter that ended with the man holding the placard, abortion on demand, no apologies, just kind of putting his head down. Maybe in shame. I don't know what actually happened, but can you tell that story in terms of the innocence?
Yeah, no, it's such a great story. We were actually at the Los Angeles Cathedral. It was for a St. Jose Maria Mass. And the cathedral's really just right downtown Los Angeles, and it's right after the Dobbs decision in late June. And my friend has 11 children, the last two who are twin girls. So he's got a lot of kids. And, he's in his early 40s, and he is walking out of the cathedral with a car seat, a baby in his arms, toddlers trailing after him. And he encounters this man who's about the same age. And, they both, the interesting thing is they both probably would have been friends in any other context. They're both kind of hip Los Angeles guys, graphic design, probably similar tastes in music. But this one man was, as you said, holding a sign that said, abortion on demand, no apologies. And my friend just looked at him and just locked eyes with him with all of his children until the pro-abortion man sort of looked down and then looked away. And I do think that it was such a wordless witness, and exactly what, that example of, when you encounter someone who is living more deeply than you are, it can be instinctively shame you. I think of that article I wrote about, it's hard for me to think very charitably about the pro-choice man because it's so unmanly. The pro-choice
Hmm.
man, maybe he's
Yeah.
deluded, maybe he's wounded, and so we need to think with charity. But what he is claiming is not protection of women. He's protecting his own right to reject women, his own right to reject children. It's such an unmanly position. So yeah, in some ways, I think like fathers, great fathers, are the greatest witness
Hmm.
against this movement because there's something undeniably beautifully appealing about a truly manly, virtuous man who
Hmm.
protects his wife, protects his children.
Yeah. I would say a great big amen to that. The example of your friend, that wordless witness, just, holding the gaze until he looked down. It just reminds me of this line that I shared in some of the ministry of men. True power doesn't need to yell.
Mm, mm,
There's a substantiveness to it. And usually that true power that's manifest in this world is 100% an icon of Christ's power himself. Not that we're manifesting it to the same degree. It's different, obviously, but it's Christ-like,
yes.
and clearly he's just in the fact that he has children. He's standing there in the love, in the generosity, in sacrifice, in all these things that we are made for. And it's just this powerful wordless witness that just, made the thinking just crumble,
Yeah.
in its appropriate shame.
I think of similar to that, although very different, it's the witness of the detransitioner.
Right.
Someone who has transitioned into the other sex and then regretted it and then sought to detransition. There's a reason why they're so reviled and so censored and silenced because they bear within their bodies the full embrace of the ideology and then
Mm.
the full regret of it and the scars that it bore on them.
Oh,
It's such an icon of the lie, exposing the lie. And so, detransitioners, I think, are such a powerful witness.
yeah. That's going to be interesting in the coming years to see all that unfold. My
Yes.
goodness. Oh, Lord have mercy.
Heartbreaking.
It is. It really is. One of the things, maybe we'll begin to make a shift because I think the family, well lived, well, I'll say it this way, and I don't know who I picked this up from, but I've taken it as my own. But the family is this unique institution, God given, God's idea, that is both a resistant cell to the craziness of postmodernity that we're seeing, but also, in the words of Pope Francis, it is a spiritual impulse that is capable of transforming everything. And so, your thoughts may be on the place of family to do just that, to provide this resistant cell, but also to be proactive, to be missionary in the world. I think the missionary dimension of the family has never been more important than it is now. And I think we have the biggest opportunity we've ever had because so much of the pain that lies under the thin veneer of everybody's hearts was inflicted in the family of origin. And good families, well loved, not perfect. I think as parents, the worst thing you can do to your kids is try and have a perfect family because it doesn't work, but good families. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that, and that will probably segue us into Theology of Home.
Yeah, no, I mean, I obviously completely agree with everything you said. I think the family's always been a totally compelling force in society, but I do agree that there's something interesting happening now where it feels more acute to me. And
Mm-hmm.
one way I look at it is that, I think in the 90s, we had this resurgence of really effective apologetics, Tom Howard, Scott Hahn, who are, well, Tom Howard is passed now, but Scott Hahn is still doing amazing work. And so many others, I could list off and name the names of so many apologists. They're fantastic. And there was a real emphasis on apologetics that was very effective for me and for so many people I know. And then for a while, I feel like the shift was on beauty, the importance of beauty to sort of penetrate into our hearts and cut through in a post rational world and affect our soul, touch our souls and stir those longings for transcendence and for something higher and deeper. And I think those two are both incredibly still effective and important. Alongside of that, I think we are now seeing a new sort of moment in evangelization, which is the ordinary, because we have become a society that has gotten so far away from the ordinary with the celebration of queer theory, transgression. We're so divorced from the ordinary life that, we think that men can become women, women become men, people can become cats or furries, as they call them.
Yeah.
This is truly bizarro world. The ordinary life of the family stands to my mind as being one of the most effective wordless witnesses that we have right now. And I have a friend who he had a hard family life, went to school, was very intelligent, got very pulled into ideology because of the very progressive professors, began to deconstruct everything.
Mm.
He deconstructed his relationships, family, society, politics, religion, until he had deconstructed all sources of meaning from his life. And he ended up staring into void and suicidal. Well, he went to speak to a colleague. He was working a high power job in DC, and his colleague was Christian and told him, I don't know who to tell, but I'm struggling with this. I'm suicidal. And, I think he'd made an attempt at that point. And his friend colleague invited him to church and then invited him to his sister and brother-in-law and their children's home for dinner. They went to the church and then they went to this family's house for dinner. The dinner was not extraordinary. It was like a bag of salad and pizza. But he had never been around a family in the intimacy of their home life that was so sort of compelling. They were not perfect, but they dealt when things went wrong or the child was crying or whining, they dealt with it with, good cheerfulness and laughed it off rather than got tense. And he kept expecting them to get angry into, the way he was raised. And that never happened. And they were funny and fun and joyful and really loved their children. And he saw family life and real love embodied in a way that he had never seen it before. So the next week he said, I didn't care about church at all, but I went back to church because I wanted to get to that dinner. And he just wanted to be around that family. And this is the power that this man who's very intellectual, it was not an argument. It was not a book, and I'm not dismissing those things. It was the very ordinary engine of family life, which is actually the engine of generation. That's a life-giving generative force in society. And so I think we have to think in that way. So when you say, the importance of family, but also as a sort of compelling force, I'm not sure how you phrased it, but as an engine of evangelization or however you want to say it, I really think we need to think about that very seriously, about how we can, think of our families in that way, with that sort of sense of mission, and encourage our children to really marry with a sort of mission. I want to marry someone not only that I'm compatible with and that with whom we can sanctify one another and our children, but who can we try to change the world together? I want someone that we can have a mission together. And that adds a real layer of, I think, richness and dynamism to a marriage, already. So, but I think it is sort of, I think, a moment of the ordinary and of the family and the very ordinary aspects of family life that actually are a window into something quite extraordinary that people I really need to see and really, I think, are hungry for, but they need to see it embodied in order to know that it's beautiful. Just talking about family values doesn't do it, right? They have to see it.
They have to see it. They have to experience it. It's incarnational for sure. There's a story of this young lady who was a very gifted athlete, invited to play in this sort of semi-professional team, who had just recently started dating this young man who came from a good family. And believe it or not, one of the things that she considered when making a decision to play with this semi-pro team is missing Sunday dinner.
Wow.
That was a powerful enough thing to be brought into the discernment whether she was going to pursue this or not. Ended up not doing it. There was many other reasons, but that was a factor, which just tells you that how compelling it is. And again, not perfect.
No.
It doesn't have to be perfect. Another story I was reminded of, my wife, actually, she got to visit the Holy Land a number of years ago. And right at that time, she was discerning whether she would want to continue having faith studies in our home because we had just, had another baby and it's just chaos with, I think it was the sixth child, maybe, whatever. And she didn't feel like her home was really beautiful enough to welcome ladies into. And she had an encounter with Our Lady in the cave at the Church of the Annunciation, I think it is, where basically the Lord really put on her heart, if Mary can bring the Word, the Son of God into her home in a cave, perhaps you could invite these ladies into the mess of your life and just have this study. So she ended up having it.
Beautiful.
And for years they went on having this study together. So yeah, I love that time or that term that you used, Noelle, about the ordinary. I think George Weigel called it the age of witness, maybe is now upon us, where that's what we really got to focus on. So anyways, in light of all that, you and Dr. Carrie Gress, I think Carrie's maybe more the founder and you were certainly involved in editor, but this whole idea of Theology of Home, it's a series of books, it's a website, it's a blog. What compelled you ladies to launch this? Why is that important right now?
Yeah. No, Carrie came up with the idea. She was actually on a treadmill and she was thinking of all the ways in which we long for a home and how compelling it is. Videos of soldiers coming home and being greeted by their families. And just that sense that we all have about walking into our homes after a long time away or an arduous trip or what have you.
Hmm.
And why is it so universally compelling? And so she wrote an article about it. And then on her prompting, I wrote an article about Theology of Home for Men, what that looked like. And then it turned into the book and the website. The website already existed. She'd started a website called Helena Daily. But then once we started with the books, then we thought, let's rebrand everything to Theology of Home. One idea is that, people need to have a universal language in a time of such disorientation. Home is a uniquely compelling force. And it's something that we're already very compelled by. If you look at the TV networks, the magazines, the remodeling industry, the home decor movement,
Hmm.
the rejection of convenience that we're seeing rise up. So, for the last 10, 15 years, you see hipsters in Brooklyn who are making bone broth, having chickens in their, on their porch and a little kitchen garden. And this idea that, there's a longing to give dignity and import to the domestic activities. And somehow there's a disconnect between that longing, that very human longing to get back to those things, and the idea that home means something deep and meaningful, and also that there's a dignity to the homemaker.
Hmm.
And so, Carrie's done a lot of work on women and feminism, and I'm sure she'll get into that with you when she's on your show. But yeah, I think that was the first and foremost the thought process, and then we realized pretty quickly it would need to be illustrated with photography, and so that's become a real important part of Theology of Home. It's just that, as I said earlier, people need to see things embodied to know that they're beautiful, and so there's been such a propaganda campaign against the goodness of home and homemaking.
Hmm.
And I think because it's so fundamental, and so it takes a whole host of coercions and manipulations to kind of try to squash it out of people. But it's a universal deep longing. So I think we can maybe obscure that longing, but we can't eradicate it. Insofar as we can sort of use media to tap into those deep longings rather than, most media is about manipulating our longings. We're trying to create media that I think is good for Catholics to create, which is uniting ourselves to our deepest longings that actually make us very human. And the Catholic Church, has historically been kind of a master of promulgating beautiful art, great craftsmanship. Carrie often talks about, how sad it is that, so many of our Catholic gifts are, cheap plastic things made in China, that shouldn't we be at the forefront of dignifying the beautiful and the ordinary? Our first book, Theology of Home 1, the subtitle is Finding the Eternal, the Everyday.
Yeah.
And I think that really is a summation of the ethos behind Theology of Home. So it's the book series, 4-book series. A wonderful woman, Emily Malloy, wrote the 4th one, who's been working with us lately. A website. We have a daily email Monday through Friday that has an aggregate of links that we've sourced through the internet. None are hostile to the faith. They're things of keeping up on current affairs, things about the faith, things about your home, organization, recipes. So a mix of things. And then a shop where we have, support local craftsmen. Carrie and her husband and her children pour all the candles. We sell our books there. So it's a bunch of different elements, but I think unified under one common vision.
That's awesome. I think one of the books is being given as a gift to some of the people that organized my daughter's bridal shower this weekend. Believe it or not.
That's great.
So there you go. So I want to merge these two things then, Noelle, sort of your work on the woke movement as well as home, because you recently wrote an article that sits on Theology of Home called 7 Ways to Keep Wokeness Out of Your Home and Away from Your Kids. So what I want to do is I just want to give by title each of the 7 and see if there's maybe a little blurb that you want to give about that. Does that sound reasonable?
Yep.
Totally didn't prepare you for this. So
that's okay.
Thanks for going with it. So the first one you talk about is cultivate a cheerful, fun, and affectionate marriage and family life. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so key. I mean, attitudes are, as they say, they're caught, not taught, and that somebody's mood really affects everyone else's mood. My husband's really big on this and, leading with good cheerfulness. And he's worked hard to be a very positive person. And it is such a balm to a family life, that if one person is grumpy and in a bad mood and frustrated, that really affects everyone. And it makes kids want to run off to their bedrooms and hide away. And, it gives into that lie that home life is always oppressive or, or bleak. And it shouldn't be. It should be joyful. And I think that kids in particular, they will be affected, and they will, even if they leave the faith, having had fostered deeply beautiful, joyful, good, affectionate memories in their childhood will always be something that is pulling them back. that people are really drawn to things that are happy and positive and joyful, as they should be, and not in a Pollyannish fake way, but you're really truly trying to seek out gratitude, and gratitude that disposes us to seeing the good in everything, and not, lamenting our circumstances when frustrations arise, but rather embracing them. Obviously, as Catholics, that's a big part of our faith is, stub your toe for thank you, Jesus. Just give me an
That's
opportunity to
right.
suffer. But yeah, but it's a hard, and only done through reliance on the grace of our Lord.
And good on your husband to develop that positivity. A lot of us men don't necessarily lean that way naturally, so that's great. He's inspiring to me. One of the things I love, there's the term affectionate marriage, because I think joyful, playful, married love in front of kids is just, I believe that a children's sense of security comes from witnessing the love affair of mom and dad.
That's right.
That translates into the world is safe. I can be creative. I can take risks because everything's okay. Right.
That's exactly right. It also makes them long for marriage because they've seen it modeled in a way that was attractive and healthy and happy.
Fun.
Make your marriage fun. Yeah.
Get on top of their technology. That's the second one.
Yeah. I mean, this is obviously an enormous beast in our society now. And, a kid with the internet in his back pocket is a recipe for utter disaster. One things that a friend of mine will tell his children when they say, don't you trust me? And he'll say, I trust you. I don't trust human nature.
I love it.
We really need to have an appropriate understanding of how tempting and that is, and how ill-equipped children are to resist that sort of natural absorption of addiction that technology is inclining us toward. It's hard enough for us as adults. So, I think families being on top of that, there's so many, good things that happen. You're helping your kids to not develop a porn addiction. You're helping them to not develop the self-absorption that comes from comparing yourself to other people, and the superficiality that begins to filter all of their days, not through what they're doing, not being lost in their activities, but being lost in the idea of being seen doing their activities. This is sort of inclining us towards narcissism. And so kids' formation has to really be protected from that, not for the sake of kind of hiding away from the world, but rather to allow the freedom for them to build real character and interests and passions and develop in a natural, normal, healthy way. So yeah, I think that should be a top concern for parents these days.
Absolutely. We could probably dwell on that for a long time, but we'll let it go. Foster discussion and dialogue. Love it. What do you want to say about that?
One of the things that I think is really key is that understand that your kids will give pushback on the faith. And if we believe that we have the truth on our side, then that is not a threat to the faith that they are questioning it. It should be, an opportunity for them to become critical thinkers. And so, my house, my father was a real philosopher, and he really encouraged debate and dialogue, and he listened to any pushback I had at any given time. And I think that really was helpful for me to feel that the truth is the point. And so I don't have to be afraid of thinking deeply through things. And another outcome of that, fostering that in your children, is that it helps them when coercive ideologies are taking over. Their friendship groups, their future work environments, that their social circles, that they will develop the ability to think deeply, and it will be repugnant any sort of environment that is suffocatingly coercive or silencing or canceling. So it's a way to kind of free them of that sort of susceptibility.
Yeah, I love the idea, just critical thinking and encouraging it. And this is one of the things that's a little bit lost, because there's critical thinking, there's critical theory. I don't know if you want to, maybe that's opening up a can of worms. Is there a quick way to make a distinction between the two?
Yeah, the easiest distinction is critical thinking is oriented towards truth, and critical theory is oriented towards power. So if your goal is truth, you invite objections, you invite dissent because you want to course correct. If your goal is power, you do not invite objections, you want to silence them, because you're not seeking to arrive at the truth. You're seeking not to dialogue, but to dominate.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. More in the book and more online as well. Fourth, introduce them to beautiful things.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think as we were talking about earlier, beauty, there's a reason why communist countries are always very ugly. They're in their architecture. Right. That there's no transcendent meaning. And so that translates into how they incarnate various realities. There's also an opposite example, the example of builders and architects who built cathedrals that they knew they would not live to see the fruition of, but they knew that they were participating in a vision that was beyond them and higher. And beauty, I think, is really important for sort of stirring in your kids that understanding without, without words, that there is something high, beautiful, transcendent to aspire to and to long for. And I think insofar we're in a culture that's really accustomizing us or enculturating us into really ugly things. If you even think
Mm.
of like the way music has changed, oftentimes, the real hip music now is just rote and banal and really a celebration, elevation of what is ugly.
Mm.
And so I think all the more important that kids should be exposed to beauty, not just in architecture, but also in beautiful music, in nature, rivers, mountains, botanical gardens. I think it could be as simple as that, but exposing your kids to beautiful things is a real important part of their formation.
And I think even teaching them to look for it, because it is everywhere when you're looking for it, but so much time on screens and elsewhere, you just are kind of blind to it. You're immune to it. One of my daughters, she almost has a daily habit of walking out of the house, and we kind of have this area where we live close to some blueberry farms, and you have an incredible view of the sunset that lasts a very long time. And she'll go out there and just take in the beauty of the sunset. And sometimes friends will go, and that's almost like an evangelical moment. But just paying attention to the beauty that's around us and teaching kids to learn how to see it, and then affirm it, it becomes this powerful force. So that's great. Think beyond your neighborhood school. That's your next thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are way past the times when we could just default to our neighborhood school. There are some families for whom it makes sense and they do it well with a lot of conversation and a lot of strong family bonds and discussion. But I think overall, the schools have just been so captured. It's very hard because and I think we've seen that in the last few years. I mean, the quarantine actually exposed a lot of that because a lot of parents were exposed to the curriculum that
Mm.
they had not heretofore known of. And nor do I think that we can default just to maybe a diocesan school. Even sometimes there, you can, if it's not really orthodox, then there can be a sort of a masquerading of Catholicism under things that are not Catholic at all. And so that in some ways could be even potentially more toxic. I think schools that have, again, getting back to the technology, have rules against iPhones. So there's not a culture. Everyone's going to have an iPhone, but your child, it's hard to find maybe, but I think increasingly it's going to become more common. There's more schools that are rising up to meet that sort of cultural need. But yeah, I think just being very intentional with those decisions, who your kids' peer groups are going to be, without sort of inducing in them a fear of the world or sort of a retreat from the world. I think it can be done in a way that is more nuanced and balanced than that. But I do think that we have to have their education and formation at the forefront of our minds.
Absolutely. It's again the Catholic mindset, both and families.
Yes.
It's protection from postmodern crazy, but it's also the spiritual impulse. It's both and. Your next one, imbue their days with a sense of mission.
I think of this as the family dinner table. At the family dinner table, we say, most families say the same things. They say, "What did you learn today? Who did you help today? There's a new kid at school. Did you reach out to them?" Kids come into the world really absorbed with their wants and needs. As you enter the world as a baby. All you can think about is, I need to sleep, I need to eat, I need to, whatever.
Yeah.
And the process of parenting is coaxing them out of that natural self-absorption and getting them to slowly start seeing their days as being imbued with one of mission. And so, and that can be a real counterbalance to kind of that school selection that, okay, maybe or my kids are in a classical Catholic school. Before that, we homeschooled, but we still have plenty of people in our lives who are not aligned with what we think and what we believe. And even amongst their friends who are struggling, friends who are going through hard things, and, giving them sort of an examination of their conscience of, how am I being a good friend to these people? How am I getting outside of myself? How am I striving to reflect Christ back to them? And how am I living my own interior life? Am I praying? And, that is something that is taught, I think, deeply through the example of the parents fostering a deep interior life of prayer themselves. And kids just naturally encounter it and they see it modeled and it becomes very normal. But there's no shortcut to it. That's what's hard about it, is that, you really have to really live it to communicate that to the kids.
Yeah. I'll tell a very short story, Noelle, about a failure as a dad moment, because my daughter was going, and the world of teenage girls is pretty vicious at times. And my daughter was in a difficult situation with one particular friend, and she kind of just disclosed some of the pain and the hurt and all this. And as I'm listening, I'm getting a little bit angered by what I heard, and I just want to protect my daughter with everything, and I want to counsel her to be strategic and strong and all this. And as she's telling me, I'm getting more ramped up, And what I disclosed to her was probably not the best bit of wisdom. And her response to me was, well, Dad, thank you. I know you care for me, but I think what I really need to do is draw closer to her, forgive her from my heart, and pray for her because she's going through a really hard time.
Mm.
And I was like, yeah, you could do that. That would probably be a
Or
better
try
thing
that.
to do. Or try that. That might be
Oh,
better.
that's beautiful. What an amazing girl.
She is a sweet, sweet girl. Lead by example in your prayer life. This is your 7th.
Oh, yeah. I just sort of bled into that answer, my last answer. But yeah, no, I do.
Yep.
I mean, I think we should be teaching our kids how to pray, but we also should be deeply living a life of prayer ourselves, and they will encounter that. I know an old priest friend of mine who, at 86, he's 86 now, but he still will recall stumbling into his parents' room and seeing his mom deep in prayer and how that marked him and how that, and his father as well. These things shape us even 80 years later. Isn't that incredible?
That's amazing. That's power. This has been great. A wonderful conversation. I really appreciate not just this, Noelle, but everything that you've stood for, all the ways, the body of work that you've done online and otherwise. It's just a great gift. So thank you very much. I don't want to wrap us up because I do have another question I want to ask, and I ask all the guests and give them an opportunity to speak to this. And it's called Keep It Real. So I'm wondering if there's anything, Noelle, you might be willing to share, maybe a difficulty or a season of suffering that you went through, that the Lord helped you get through, and all the benefits of that. And the reason why we have this is because sometimes when people come on with a bit of a platform, their humanity is out. And it's like people can't identify with writing a book. Most people that are listening to this have never written a book. Most people have never been asked to give a conference or all the things that you've done. But I suspect some of the suffering they've gone through, you've gone through. And there's a bond that happens through listener and my guests when they're able to share. So is there anything that comes to mind that you would want to give glory to God to get you through a season of suffering and difficulty you overcame?
Yeah, the first example that comes to mind is, so we have 6 children, but we've also lost 6. And the first time was really quite traumatic. I was actually 20 weeks pregnant with twin boys, and I didn't realize
Ooh.
that I was carrying twins. I'd sort of suspected that I was, but hadn't been able to get in for an ultrasound, and my doctor thought I
Mm,
hadn't been that nauseous, and so I probably wasn't. I was just big because this was
mm,
after this is my 4th pregnancy, and I was due for an ultrasound on a Monday, and Sunday afternoon my water broke, and so we went to the hospital. They did an ultrasound, turned out twins, and
mm,
they were both still alive. So we had a good priest friend we were consulting with and a Catholic perinatologist, and we were desperate to find a way to keep them
mm,
in, and but the doctor finally just had to say there's just no way, your water's all gone.
mm,
And like 22 weeks is the earliest that anyone that they at that time, this was 16 years ago, so they were born. My husband baptized them. Someone had come in the middle of the night, a good friend had come in the
mm,
middle of the night to bring us holy water, and he was able to do an emergency baptism, and we named them. And then I had a single miscarriage after that. And then years later, had another set of twins,
oh my
amazingly,
goodness.
that we lost early on. So, and I remember going to that ultrasound too, and this was maybe only like 10 weeks. And I said, I have a feeling I'm carrying twins. And she said, no, your record shows you've already had twins. People don't have 2 sets of twins.
Oh,
And I was like, well, I feel like I am. And I was, but they had already both passed. Anyway, so, and then
mm,
another single miscarriage. So, one of the things that I remember after the first set of twins, Luke and Peter, feeling, we'd been house hunting before then, and feeling like, I don't, it's so weird to me that I cared so much about house hunting. It doesn't matter. That's the
mm,
sort of thing that suffering gives you. Another experience I
yeah,
had was, my husband was so caring for me in that time. And I really thought, the last thing I would ever want is for pain to be divisive. And so I just had a
mhm,
sort of not a fear, but an awareness that sometimes couples go through hard things and it divides them. And I wanted to be very conscientious of that. And then I think another grace I was given was I didn't want it to define me. I didn't want to be defined as where my suffering became a trophy, and that I think
right.
sometimes people can do. And then I had some real wisdom spoken to me. A wise woman said to me, the devil will try to confuse you in your pain. And so I was very aware of that and tried to think with simplicity, how can I, not let confusion enter into this? So there were a lot of just sort of like moments of grace, I feel like, where God illuminated things for me. And I think it was helpful, formative for our family, just having the kids experience that level of suffering and have an awareness of death that they wouldn't have been afforded easily otherwise. And
Mm,
then I think that what it also has taught me is that being open to life is being open to death. And being open,
mm,
the point of being open to life is not that you're just going to have a ton of babies. It can be that you're infertile. It can be that you're just vulnerable. And so I think that that's a solidarity that a lot of women need to know, because I think there's a lot of women who either have had great infertility or who have gone through lots of loss and maybe feel like they're not living up to the ideal of the Catholic mother, if they don't have 20,000 kids running around it,
right.
and I think that the point is being the openness. The point is not the result, and we're not in charge of that result. So I am deeply grateful. I really feel so grateful for the sorrow and the joy, that
Mm,
I wouldn't undo it. I have a good friend who just went through her own suffering. She lost a full term baby
mm,
at the last minute, a kink in the umbilical cord. And she told me the most beautiful story that I'll share, that she was, distraught. And this priest said to her, you really talk to Jesus about what you're experiencing. And she was afraid to do that in a way because she thought she'd just start sobbing in adoration in front of all these other people. But she just said, why did I have to lose my daughter? And she had clearly this understanding. God said to her, because otherwise you wouldn't be here with me now.
oof,
And I think that that is the greatest message of suffering, lesson of suffering, is that, nothing is really, there's no evil that can befall us other than our sin. And so any sort of cross we're given, any sort of suffering or traumatic or tragedy we experience, the only thing that is really ultimately, finally tragic is if we pull away from our Lord. And insofar as
mm,
it becomes an instrument to closeness and intimacy with Him, then praise God, we can be grateful for that.
yeah. Oh, wow. I never know, Noelle, what my guests are going to say. I just really thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that's going to be touching a lot of listeners. My wife and I, we lost one child probably on December 26th, Feast of the Holy Innocents, which was itself kind of a
Oh,
blessing. But one of the things that certainly over the years, the reality of it and the truth of it has just hit home time and time again, is that Jesus never came to eliminate suffering or to explain it away, but to fill it with his presence. And I think what you said about, the real tragedy is kind of moving away from him is just a great invitation to take that suffering to him, to be with him, to be real, to be honest. So I want to honor you for sharing that. So thank you for that gift.
yeah. No, thank you. I don't think I've talked about that in an interview before. So,
No,
yeah.
well, I appreciate it and hold it with due reverence. And what a blessing that the suffering can lead you and your husband closer together. My wife and I, the same. I'm just so grateful for the seasons that we've gone through, that they bring stronger, not divide. Oh, that is an extra pain that nobody wants to have in
Yeah,
the midst of it. So thank you.
absolutely.
Thank your husband. I think we've come to the end, but I want to know sort of what's next for Noelle Mering. Do you have another book on the go? Is there something exciting on the horizon?
I actually do. Book writing is such a beast that for a while, I knew I couldn't take on another project until I really felt strongly about it. And praise God, I have something I feel very strongly about. It's actually not that far out of line with the last line of questioning about the family. And I have an agent this time, so we are finalizing it to start getting proposed and submitted around. So we shall see. But yeah, I'm excited about that.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. I look forward to it. Tell us where to find you. I think we've dropped a lot of hints, but maybe where can we find you online?
Well, theologyofhome.com is the best place. I also have a personal website, noellemering.com, where I put my articles and interviews, and these will all go on Theology of Home too. And also, I'm a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which is eppc.org. And I have a scholar page there that amplifies my work and interviews and stuff there too.
That's great. Thank you for that. Thank you so much for being here. It really was an edifying conversation for me, and I'm sure for all the listeners. So I really appreciate it, Noelle. Thank you.
Likewise, thank you.
I thank you, listeners, for joining. I'm sure that this episode has been a blessing, and we'll see you next time.